Sophie had only one dream, to become a violinist, but every time the teacher called her to the stage, it was never to honor her talent. It was always to turn her into a joke. A black girl, the daughter of a janitor with worn-out shoes and an old violin held together by tape. These were all reasons for the hall to fill with quiet, mocking laughter. "What can this girl possibly play?" one teacher whispered doubtfully. But the moment Sophie drew her bow across the strings, the entire hall fell silent. The smiles vanished, and every back straightened, as if breath itself had stopped. And in those few short seconds, everything changed completely. Sophie Carter, a petite 14-year-old black girl, quietly walked down the familiar long hallway. Her dark skin stood out among the sea of white students wearing expensive, clean uniforms. Sophie lowered her head, trying to shrink herself to avoid the prying eyes and the malicious whispers. Sophie was the only daughter of James Carter, a kind, devoted man who had worked as a janitor at this prestigious school for nearly a decade. Every day, after school hours, the girl would stay behind to help her father clean the hallways and classrooms. It was during these moments that she quietly nurtured a small dream, to become a violinist. On late afternoons, when the school was completely empty, Sophie would sit in the dark corner of the music room, gently caressing the old violin her father had found in a forgotten corner of the school's storage. The worn-out instrument, with its faded wood, had been carefully patched up with tape and a bit of glue by her father. It wasn't perfect, but it was her most precious possession, the only friend who listened to every secret dream Sophie held. However, that dream had never received support or encouragement from her classmates or teachers. On the contrary, the mockery and prejudice cut deep into Sophie's heart like a sharp knife, growing stronger with each passing day. One time, during a break between classes, Sophie accidentally overheard a group of wealthy white girls gossiping right outside the restroom door. "Look, Sophie Carter is wandering the hallway with that old violin. What is she going to do? Play some street jazz? Oh, how pathetic. Her dad is just a janitor. Maybe she should settle for a future job like him. An artist? Keep dreaming." Their laughter rang out, bitter and sharp, like a cold cut into Sophie's soul. She stood still behind the wall, her throat tight with emotion. Sophie gripped the violin in her hands, tears welling up, but she swallowed them back, silently vowing to herself that no one would see that weakness. Another day, in music class, while Mrs. Helen Harper was guiding the students through various instruments, Sophie mustered all her courage to raise her hand and timidly asked, "Miss Harper, would it be possible for me to join the school orchestra? I've been teaching myself violin for quite a while." Miss Harper looked at Sophie with a skeptical gaze mixed with a hint of coldness. "Oh, Sophie, are you sure? We don't use cheap and unprofessional instruments here." The class erupted in laughter at what seemed like an offhand comment but was filled with disdain. Sophie lowered her head, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. No one in class stood up for her. No one cared about how she felt. The hurt grew deeper in Sophie's heart, but at the same time, it silently fueled a stronger desire than ever before. That afternoon, as the sun began to set, Sophie sat alone in the quiet music room, the old violin trembling in her hands. The shaky sound of the violin filled the room, resonating the first notes of a symphony she had often listened to secretly on the old phone her father bought her with his meager wages. In that small room, the violin's sound was a whisper of comfort, lifting her up after all the pain. "One day I will make everyone listen to me," Sophie whispered in the dark room, her eyes burning with more determination than ever, despite the wounds slowly smoldering in her small heart. Little did she know, the opportunity to prove herself would come sooner than she ever imagined. A grand opportunity, but also one full of bitterness and challenge, was about to change Sophie Carter's life forever. Sophie never imagined that the opportunity to prove herself would come so quickly, but unfortunately it came from a cruel joke. Just 1 week after Sophie's humiliating experience with Miss Harper's mockery, Ashwood High School was buzzing with preparations for the annual talent show, a much-anticipated event that all the students eagerly awaited. The atmosphere was filled with excitement and cheer throughout the hallways, but Sophie silently stood in a quiet corner, observing her classmates busy preparing their performances. From a distance, Miss Helen Harper, in her elegant dress, stood with a few other younger teachers. She glanced at Sophie, then turned back to chat with a smile that seemed oddly difficult to interpret. Miss Harper was known as the best music teacher in the school, but she was also notorious for her cold, strict attitude towards students she deemed unworthy, and unfortunately, Sophie was on that list. Miss Harper had always favored the wealthy white students, those with the best resources to develop their talents, and Sophie, the poor black girl, seemed to hold no value in her eyes. A few minutes later, Miss Harper stepped onto the stage, clapping her hands lightly to capture the attention of the bustling crowd. "All right, everyone. We've seen many impressive performances today, but today, I think we should give a special opportunity to the student least noticed in our school. Sophie Carter, where are you?" The name Sophie Carter echoed through the speakers, causing the entire auditorium to fall into an odd state. Half curiosity, half mockery. All eyes from the students and teachers turned toward Sophie, who was frozen in the corner of the stage. Her heart raced, her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected Miss Harper to do this to her, and even less expected her to use such a polite tone to mask the cruelty behind it. Sophie glanced at her father, James Carter, standing by the stage door, still holding the mop in his hand. The kind-hearted black man's face tightened with worry. His eyes filled with pain as he looked at his daughter, as if to say, "You don't have to do this if you don't want to." But deep inside, Sophie understood that this was her only chance, even though it was being offered with such malicious mockery. She decided to step forward, clutching the old violin tightly to her chest. Whispers began to spread as Sophie climbed the stairs to the stage in her worn-out shoes, nearly falling apart. The group of wealthy white girls at the far right corner of the auditorium whispered to each other, exchanging mischievous and cruel glances. One of them, Emily Walker, the mayor's daughter and the top student of the school, sneered at her friends. "Let's see what kind of fool this Sophie will make of herself. I bet she doesn't even know how to hold the violin properly." The giggles of her friends only made Sophie feel like her steps grew heavier. But she stood tall, taking a deep breath, and walked to the center of the stage. Miss Harper stood beside her, her voice full of false sympathy. "Sophie, my dear, I'm so curious to hear you play today. I hope you'll give us a performance we'll all remember." The implied meaning in Miss Harper's words made the entire hall burst into laughter once again. Sophie swallowed back her tears, silently raising the old violin to her shoulder. Her heart felt like it was about to break into 1,000 pieces, but when she looked out and saw her father's anxious yet loving gaze, filled with trust and belief, a strange strength surged within her. She couldn't disappoint her father. She couldn't let all the people waiting for her to fail achieve their cruel goal so easily. Sophie gently placed the bow on the strings. Her small hand still trembled, but her eyes shone brighter than ever. Amid the mocking whispers and giggles echoing throughout the hall, Sophie closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to draw the bow. The first note from the violin rang out like a small ray of light, piercing through the cold, indifferent atmosphere that filled the room. And in that instant, everything around Sophie seemed to fall into silence. No one could have expected that the music from this poor black girl playing on an old, broken violin would contain such a magical power, power enough to touch the deepest corners of every soul present in the room. But this was just the beginning. Sophie didn't know that what would happen next would far exceed her imagination and that of everyone waiting to mock her from the sidelines. The moment the bow touched the strings, Sophie felt as if her heart had stopped. The vast auditorium now seemed like a cold arena, where hundreds of sharp eyes were waiting for her to fail. The mocking smiles from the audience below were like sharp needles piercing her heart, making her already trembling hands shake even more. Her eyes accidentally glanced over at Emily Walker, the wealthy white girl with sharp green eyes and a haughty sneer, looking at her with disdain. Emily had once been Sophie's close friend when they were younger, before the gap of wealth and racial prejudice had destroyed their innocent friendship. Beside Emily, her friends giggled and covered their mouths as if afraid Sophie would see them. But it was clear that they all wanted her to realize she was nothing more than a joke in their eyes. On the right side of the stage, Miss Helen Harper stood with her arms crossed, her crimson lips curling into a cold smile, her sharp gaze seeming to say, "Let's see how long you can endure before you make a fool of yourself." To Miss Harper, Sophie was just a minor mistake, a poor black girl unworthy of standing on this prestigious stage. Sophie stood frozen for a second, the feeling of shame and humiliation flooding her body. In that moment, deep inside, Sophie wanted to give up. But then, in the darkest moment of despair, she caught her father's gaze from the side of the stage. James Carter, still holding the mop tightly in his hands, was silently watching his daughter with eyes full of unconditional love. In that brief moment, Sophie could almost hear her father's voice again from those late nights when he sat repairing the old violin. "My dear, sometimes life will try to pull you down, but courage is not about being fearless. It's about deciding to stand up no matter how scared you are." Those gentle, sincere words echoed loudly in Sophie's mind, becoming a powerful source of strength that awakened the courage lying dormant inside her. Sophie took a deep breath, gripped the violin tightly, and made a decision. Today, she would not run away from those contemptuous stares. Sophie gently drew the bow across the strings, her small fingers placing the bow on the strings with practiced, decisive movements. The first sound rang out, fragile yet powerful, filling the vast space, breaking the suffocating atmosphere of mockery. In an instant, the mocking smiles faded, replaced by a complete silence, full of surprise and skepticism. Sophie closed her eyes, letting her soul merge with the music, each note following the other as if telling a story that had never been spoken before. The music she played was no longer just sound, but a narrative soaked in pain, longing, and the deep wounds she had endured over the years. Each note was like a tear, a quiet sob that Sophie could never express in words. Emily and her friends stood frozen, their eyes wide in disbelief, as if they couldn't believe the sound was coming from the old violin of the girl they had once looked down upon. In the corner of the stage, the smug smile on Miss Harper's face gradually faded, replaced by an expression of stunned disbelief. She clenched her hands, unable to comprehend how a child like Sophie could play such an emotionally rich piece of music. Under the stage lights, Sophie seemed to forget all the pain she had just endured. At this moment, it was just her and her beloved violin, and the music flowing through her soul, healing every wound. The music stretched on, growing stronger with each note, echoing far and wide, as if to declare to everyone that she was not a joke, and certainly not a mistake. In the distance, James Carter stood, watching his daughter, his eyes welling up with tears he hadn't noticed until now. That poor father had finally witnessed the moment when his daughter stood strong, facing all the cruel prejudices of the world outside. When the music ended with a long, resonant note, the entire auditorium sank into absolute silence. Sophie opened her eyes, nervously glancing down at the audience, waiting for a reaction from those who had mocked her just moments before. For the first time, their gazes no longer carried contempt or ridicule. Instead, there was astonishment mixed with admiration and a tinge of shame. But would this admiration be enough to change the deeply rooted prejudices in their minds? Sophie didn't know. The only thing she was sure of in that moment was that her heart had just won the most important battle of her life. However, Sophie did not realize that today's performance would open a new chapter, leading her on a journey full of turmoil and challenges, far beyond anything she had ever imagined before. In the deep silence following the final note of the violin, Sophie slowly lowered her bow, her heart still pounding as if it couldn't quite grasp what had just happened. At that moment, the large auditorium of Ashwood High seemed to freeze, descending into an absolute stillness where you could hear the faintest breaths of those sitting below. Every eye was fixed on the petite black girl, but now no one was laughing. The mocking laughter from before had vanished, replaced by stunned, amazed expressions tinged with shame. From the front row, Emily Walker let her hands fall limply, her proud lips slightly parted in disbelief, unable to fathom what she had just heard. Emily's friends stood motionless, exchanging confused glances, as if asking themselves, "What have we missed about this girl all this time?" At the side of the stage, Miss Helen Harper stood frozen, her hand still gripping her pen unconsciously, her face paling beneath her perfect makeup. For the first time in her life, she felt exposed to the truth about her own narrow-mindedness and cruelty. She had always considered Sophie nothing more than a poor, useless child, but the music she had just played was a powerful reprimand, clearly demonstrating how wrong she had been. Sophie stood in the middle of the vast stage, her small body feeling tiny under the blinding lights. She looked up at her father, James Carter, who still stood silently behind the wings. His eyes shone with pride, but also with tears of emotion he had never dared to show in front of his daughter. Sophie understood that, at that moment, she had done something monumental, something that had broken free from the cruel prejudices that had kept her in the shadows for so long. Just then, a small, tentative clap rang out from the back of the auditorium, as if the person clapping was also trying to overcome their own embarrassment. It was Mr. Gregory Harris, the elderly history teacher, a man known for rarely showing any outward emotion. But today, his face was one of unmistakable admiration. Immediately, more claps followed, spreading from sporadic to louder, quickly becoming an unstoppable wave across the entire hall. The entire Ashwood auditorium shook with the sound of applause, accompanied by whistles and astonished cheers. Sophie stood still, unsure how to react to this sudden change. This was the first time she had ever felt the recognition, the respect, that she had never dared to dream of. Emily Walker and her wealthy friends reluctantly stood and clapped lightly, their eyes still full of surprise mixed with envy. Emily bowed her head, trying to hide the shame burning inside her, silently blaming herself for being so shallow, for judging others by their appearance and background. At the side of the stage, Miss Harper took a step back, retreating from the spotlight, her heart stirring with an internal storm. She had always prided herself on her ability to recognize musical talent, yet she had been completely blind to Sophie's extraordinary abilities, simply because of the deep-seated prejudice and racism that had clouded her mind for so long. The feelings of guilt, mixed with self-loathing, made her silently withdraw to the back. Sophie was still in a daze, not fully grasping the significance of the moment, when she suddenly noticed her father stepping out from behind the stage. The poor janitor father now walked towards her, shedding the hesitations he had always carried. James Carter moved to his daughter's side, gently taking her small, trembling hand, overcome with emotion. In front of everyone, he whispered proudly, "My daughter, today you've shown them who you really are." Sophie looked at her father, and for the first time, tears fell from her eyes. These were not tears of sorrow, but tears of happiness and relief. She nodded gently, for the first time in her life feeling that she was no longer alone. Amid the still thundering applause that had yet to subside, Sophie realized that today's performance had changed everything. Not only for her, but for all those who had once carried prejudice and narrow-mindedness within them. However, what Sophie and the entire Ashwood Auditorium didn't yet realize was that this event was just the beginning of a long journey ahead. A journey where Sophie would not only have to face society's doubts, but also overcome her own limitations to discover the person she had always longed to become. As the thunderous applause began to subside, silence once again enveloped the Ashwood Auditorium. In the harsh stage lights, Sophie stood there, small but proud, beside her father, James Carter, who was still gently holding her hand, as if to transmit more strength. From behind the wings, Miss Helen Harper unexpectedly stepped forward, her footsteps echoing sharply on the wooden floor, filled with tension. Her gaze was colder than ever, no longer holding any semblance of goodwill, but instead marked with clear confusion and doubt. She could hardly believe that Sophie, the poor black girl she had once looked down on, could move the entire auditorium with such a deeply emotional performance. Miss Harper stopped in front of Sophie, looking straight into her eyes with a stern expression, as if trying to find the answer to a mystery she couldn't comprehend. In a cold voice, she asked loudly, so the entire auditorium could hear, "Sophie Carter, please answer honestly. Who taught you to play like that?" Her question caused a stir in the audience. The students around immediately began to whisper, their curious and suspicious gazes focused on Sophie. Everyone assumed that perhaps some secret music teacher had been behind Sophie's unexpected success. But Sophie stood there, calm and steadfast, though her eyes showed a hint of confusion under the suspicion now surrounding her. Emily Walker, sitting in the front of the auditorium, watched Sophie intently, her heart unexpectedly rising with a strange hope that Sophie would be flustered, confused, and unable to answer. Emily thought to herself, surely someone must have been helping Sophie, because there was no way someone like Sophie could have accomplished something so extraordinary on her own. Sophie remained silent for a moment, then gently lifted her eyes to meet Miss Harper's gaze. In a quiet but clear voice, she responded, "Miss Harper, no one taught me. Everything I know, I taught myself." Sophie's simple yet confident answer made Miss Harper raise an eyebrow in disbelief. She smiled faintly, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was laced with a bitter doubt. "Do you really think I and everyone here will believe such nonsense, Sophie? Don't be shy. Tell us the truth. Who secretly taught you to play the violin?" Sophie swallowed lightly, feeling her heart race with anxiety, but she was determined not to let herself falter. She looked around the auditorium, noticing the hundreds of eyes waiting for her response. Once again, she spoke with even more conviction, her voice echoing clearly across the room. "Miss Harper, the truth is, I completely taught myself. I didn't have the money to study with anyone. I learned from old music CDs my father has had for a long time, and from free videos on the internet." Her sincere, simple answer once again left the entire auditorium in stunned silence. Whispers spread throughout the room. Emily Walker's eyes widened in astonishment, her fair, beautiful face flushing with embarrassment as she recalled the cruel mockery she had made of Sophie earlier. Her friends, too, were taken aback, exchanging uncomfortable glances. In the middle of the auditorium, Mr. Gregory Harris, the first to applaud, stood up again, clapping once more with admiration and deep emotion for Sophie's incredible determination. Several other teachers followed, standing to applaud, shaking their heads in disbelief at this unexpected truth. Miss Harper stood motionless, her eyes flashing with rare confusion. Inside, she was battling a fierce internal struggle between feelings of shame and anger. She had once thought Sophie unworthy of attention, unworthy of investment, but now she had to face the truth that she had overlooked an extraordinary musical talent simply because of her personal prejudices and foolish pride. Sophie gently tightened her grip on her father's hand, feeling warmth and safety as she stood beside him. She never expected her honest confession to have such an impact, but she knew now she was no longer just Sophie Carter, the black girl looked down upon. She had become a living testament to resilience and perseverance, defying the harsh circumstances and societal prejudices. However, what Sophie didn't yet realize at that moment was that the story that had just unfolded would quickly extend beyond the walls of Ashwood Auditorium, opening new opportunities and challenges that could forever change her life. The moment Sophie revealed that she had taught herself to play the violin solely through old music CDs and free online videos, the entire Ashwood Auditorium was plunged into an unprecedented shock. In an instant, the silence enveloped the room like a cold mist, creating such a heavy atmosphere that one could almost feel the collective breath of the hundreds of people in the room freezing. As the auditorium still grappled with the unbelievable truth, Ms. Helen Harper seemed unable to believe her own ears. Her face flushed with both embarrassment over her previous misguided prejudices and anger at how Sophie had completely upended her worldview. For years, she had believed that children from poor backgrounds, especially a black girl like Sophie, would never be capable of standing alongside her elite, wealthy students. But now, right before her, that prejudice had been torn apart by this small, unassuming girl. Miss Harper's mind seemed to be torn by an internal battle. Part of her wanted to quickly leave the stage to escape the humiliation, but another part urged her towards something different. As a music teacher, regardless of her biases, she still had an obligation to recognize and nurture real talent. And right now that talent stood before her, small but shining like a rough diamond illuminating the darkness. After a long, awkward silence, Miss Harper decided to break the tension. She took a deep breath, her voice softer now, less cold but still carrying a note of sternness. "Sophie, no matter what, I must admit that your performance has far exceeded all of our expectations." Her words took the auditorium by surprise once again. Emily Walker's eyes widened in shock, her heart tightening with jealousy, but she could not deny the admiration creeping into her thoughts. Sophie looked at Miss Harper, remaining silent, her heart racing, unsure of what else Miss Harper was about to say. Miss Harper continued, this time with a tone that seemed more genuine, though still somewhat forced. "With such innate talent, I think you should try your hand in a truly professional music environment. Sophie, have you ever heard of the Juilliard School?" The name Juilliard struck like a bolt of lightning in the Ashwood Auditorium. This was not a name unfamiliar to them, as Juilliard was one of the top music schools in the world, a place where the greatest musical talents of the performing arts were nurtured. Even for the wealthiest and most talented students at Ashwood, Juilliard remained a dream that felt nearly unreachable. A series of whispers erupted throughout the room. No one could believe that Miss Harper, who had only recently mocked Sophie, was now suggesting that the girl audition for such a prestigious institution like Juilliard. Emily Walker's eyes grew wider than ever before, and inside her, an unjustified anger began to rise. She felt as though Miss Harper was mocking her by making an impossible suggestion for Sophie, a poor black girl with no foundation or means to pursue such a lofty dream. Sophie stood motionless on stage, her heart pounding like it might explode. Of course, she knew about Juilliard. During the long, cold nights beside her father's old violin, she had dreamed of that very school, imagining herself learning and growing alongside the world's most brilliant musical geniuses. But that dream had always felt so far away, so unattainable for Sophie, a girl who lived in harsh reality, full of hardship and scarcity. She gently shook her head, her large eyes glistening with sadness, but also determination. In a soft voice, but loud enough for the entire auditorium to hear, Sophie spoke, as if trying to comfort herself more than anyone else. "Thank you, Miss Harper, for thinking of me, but I don't think I can audition for Juilliard. I know my abilities, and I understand my place. That school is too far out of reach for me. I don't belong there." Sophie's refusal echoed with despair, and the auditorium sank into a terrifying silence. No one dared speak, no one dared protest or cheer. Sophie's answer carried a heartbreaking resignation, a sense of defeat before even beginning the race. Miss Harper stood frozen before Sophie's answer, for the first time truly seeing the consequences of the prejudices she and society had instilled in Sophie's soul. This child had been taught that her dreams were always a luxury, that a poor black girl would never be good enough, never worthy of the best things life had to offer. And now, even with the greatest opportunity right before her, Sophie couldn't bring herself to grasp it. Emily, sitting below, suddenly felt her heart tighten. For the first time, she saw Sophie not as a rival, but as a victim of the very prejudices and cruel words she had once cast upon her. Emily felt a strange sense of shame and sorrow. The oppressive atmosphere lingered, stretching out indefinitely. But none of them knew that, in that very moment of despair, someone who would completely change Sophie's fate had quietly entered the auditorium, preparing to create a turning point that Sophie would never forget. In the moment of despair that hung over the entire Ashwood auditorium, with every eye on Sophie filled with sympathy and helplessness, a strong, deep voice suddenly rang out from the back of the room, shattering the heavy atmosphere. It would be a shame for such exceptional talent to be wasted due to a bit of doubt or self-doubt. The entire auditorium immediately turned to look behind, searching for the source of the voice, and almost in unison they held their breath as they saw a well-dressed man in a dark blue suit, with a confident and charismatic presence, slowly making his way to the stage. The man was none other than Daniel Whitmore, world-renowned violinist, Juilliard graduate with honors, and one of the most respected music judges in the United States today. His face was so familiar that several students immediately whispered his name to each other in astonishment. Emily Walker's mouth dropped open in shock, and a wave of intense jealousy surged inside her. Emily had always been proud of her status, but she had never imagined that someone of Daniel Whitmore's caliber would appear at Ashwood, especially to pay attention to Sophie, the very person she had always looked down on and mocked. Miss Helen Harper could not hide her extreme astonishment. Her face turned pale, and her hand trembled slightly as she realized the person walking toward her was Daniel Whitmore, an artist she deeply admired and one of her musical idols for many years. Miss Harper felt her entire sense of pride and self-respect crumble. The child she had mocked, the one she had disregarded, was now being acknowledged and highly regarded by someone she held in such esteem. Daniel Whitmore stepped onto the stage gracefully but with authority. Each of his steps made the audience hold their breath in anticipation. When he stopped beside Sophie, he looked at her with a gentle, affectionate gaze that made Sophie's small heart tremble with both fear and hope. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, turned to face the audience, and his voice rang out clearly, full of certainty. "My name is Daniel Whitmore, and perhaps some of you here know me. I've witnessed countless performances, but I must admit that today's performance by Sophie Carter is truly something rare in my entire career." Once again, all eyes turned to Sophie. Whitmore's words were like a bolt of lightning, waking everyone from their slumber of prejudice. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes wide with confusion, but also filled with emotion and gratitude. She could hardly believe that the dream she had once thought impossible was now right in front of her, and the person making it happen was a famous figure she had only seen on television. Daniel Whitmore continued, his voice sincere and resolute. "I've been quietly sitting at the back of the auditorium since the rehearsal this morning, not looking for any talent specifically, but just passing through. But then I heard this young girl's music, and I immediately knew I had witnessed something special, something even Juilliard would covet." He turned to Sophie, his smile gentle like a father speaking to his daughter. "Sophie, I clearly heard your response to Miss Harper, and I understand that you feel Juilliard is too far out of reach. But trust me, you are exactly the kind of student Juilliard is always looking for. True talent does not discriminate by wealth, skin color, or any boundaries society tries to impose." Sophie's throat tightened, and tears welled up in her eyes. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Whitmore continued, "If your concern is finances, then from this moment on, I will cover all costs associated with your application and training. You don't need to worry about anything, other than how to fully develop the extraordinary talent you possess." Whitmore's powerful declaration once again left the auditorium in complete astonishment. Emily Walker sat in stunned silence, her heart squeezing with jealousy and deep regret. Miss Harper seemed unable to stand, gripping the microphone nearby, her breath coming in short gasps from the mixture of emotion and profound shame. Mr. James Carter stood quietly, his humble face filled with both pride and confusion. He knew that from this moment his daughter's life would change forever. Sophie looked at her father, her eyes silently asking for his opinion. Mr. Carter gently nodded, tears silently falling from his eyes, not from sorrow, but from happiness and deep gratitude. Daniel Whitmore reached out and gently took Sophie's trembling hand, looking directly into her eyes, his voice steady and filled with resolve. "Sophie, will you allow me to accompany you on your journey to Juilliard?" The entire auditorium fell silent, waiting for Sophie's answer. That moment seemed to stretch on forever, but it was full of expectation and hope. Sophie looked deep into Daniel Whitmore's sincere eyes, and she knew that the distant dream she once thought impossible had finally opened up before her. A completely new life was waiting for Sophie Carter from this very moment. In the moment of tension that gripped the entire Ashwood auditorium, with every gaze directed at Sophie, filled with sympathy and helplessness, Daniel Whitmore's heartfelt offer was like a spring breeze, gently opening a door Sophie had never dared to imagine. However, even though that dream was now within reach, Sophie stood still, unable to respond. Her clear eyes were fixed on her trembling hands, and a wave of anxiety and unease slowly spread in her heart. From the side of the stage, Mr. James Carter quietly observed every small change in his daughter's face. The man, with dark skin and a rugged face worn by years of hard labor, understood deeply what was going on in Sophie's heart at that moment. He knew his daughter always thought of him first whenever faced with any opportunity. Sophie had never allowed herself to dream of happiness or success because she feared that it would require her father to sacrifice once more. Below the stage, Emily Walker watched Sophie's reaction closely, her eyes filled with conflicting hope. Part of Emily selfishly hoped that Sophie would refuse, because if Sophie turned down this opportunity, Emily would no longer have to face the feeling of inferiority she once had toward the girl she had always looked down on. But deep down, Emily felt guilty and wanted Sophie to accept, hoping that it would ease the growing remorse gnawing at her conscience. Ms. Helen Harper, too, was holding her breath, her heart racing. She both hoped Sophie would accept, so she could somewhat redeem her past mistakes, but at the same time feared that if Sophie agreed, she would have to directly face the consequences of her own arrogance and deep-seated racial prejudice. The atmosphere in the auditorium was taut like a violin string. All eyes were on the small girl standing in the spotlight awaiting her response. Sophie slowly lifted her eyes to look at Daniel Whitmore, then turned to her father. Her eyes were filled with sadness and worry, as if a fierce battle was raging within her. Finally, Sophie turned to her father, her small lips trembling as she whispered to him in a soft voice filled with the most genuine emotion from the depths of her heart. "Dad, I'm not sure if I should do this. If I agree, will it make things harder for you? I don't want my dream to make you sacrifice again." Her soft words cut into Mr. James's heart like a sharp knife. He felt the deep pain in his daughter's voice, as well as the greatest fear she had always tried to hide from him. He slowly approached Sophie, placing his weathered hands on her shoulders, looking deep into her eyes with all the tenderness and warmth of a father. "My daughter, all my life, I've lived only to see you happy and successful. I know you always worry about me, but today, please hear me. You should never give up on your dreams because of me. I will be fine. No matter how hard it gets for me, seeing you walk the path you dream of is the greatest happiness I could ever ask for." Mr. James' voice trembled with emotion, and tears rolled down his weathered face, full of pride. Sophie had never seen her father cry before, and in that moment, her heart melted completely. The fear and unease inside her began to dissolve with each of her father's sincere words, leaving only one thing in her heart: a fierce belief in herself and a desire to move forward. The auditorium fell into complete silence, everyone moved by the sacred moment between father and daughter. Emily Walker silently bowed her head, tears suddenly streaming down her face as she truly understood the meaning of love and unconditional sacrifice for the first time. Miss Harper turned away, hiding her emotions behind her cold exterior, struggling to suppress the overwhelming shame rising in her heart. Daniel Whitmore stood patiently, his gaze gentle and full of empathy, watching the father and daughter. He understood that this was the sacred moment they needed to overcome their greatest fear. After a long silence, Sophie finally turned to Mr. Whitmore, her eyes now shining with a newfound determination. "Mr. Whitmore, I agree. I will do my best not to disappoint you." The entire auditorium erupted into thunderous applause. The gazes from below the stage had completely changed. Not a trace of doubt or ridicule remained, only belief and hope for a bright future for Sophie. Daniel Whitmore smiled with satisfaction, nodding gently at Sophie, his eyes also filled with deep joy. He turned to Mr. James Carter and spoke with clear respect. "Mr. Carter, you have an incredible daughter. I promise you, I will do everything I can to help Sophie reach as far as she can." Mr. James Carter nodded gently, his eyes still wet, but this time filled with immense happiness. He understood that from this moment on, Sophie's life would turn a completely new page, where she would live fully with her dreams. A dream he had never stopped believing in, no matter the circumstances. And Sophie, for the first time in her life, was ready to face the challenges ahead, challenges that would change her life forever. The moment Sophie nodded in agreement, Daniel Whitmore immediately felt a noticeable shift in the atmosphere around her. It was a blend of immense joy and an undeniable sense of confusion. He understood that she was stepping into an entirely new world, one that was both exciting and terrifying. The dream she had once considered far off was now within her reach, yet it also carried pressures and challenges she couldn't yet foresee. After the auditorium began to empty, Daniel Whitmore gently placed his hand on Sophie's shoulder, offering a warm smile and speaking with sincerity to both her and Mr. James Carter. "If you both have time, I'd like to invite you to a place. I think Sophie needs to see the future she is heading toward." Sophie's eyes flickered with a bit of confusion, and she looked at her father, who gave her a gentle nod of encouragement. They were quickly escorted by Mr. Whitmore out of the auditorium, where a sleek black car was waiting outside. Just minutes later, Sophie and her father were sitting in the luxurious car, silently watching the city pass by outside the window. Throughout the journey, Sophie remained almost completely silent. Her mind was still struggling to grasp everything that had just happened. The painful memories of ridicule, mockery, and the hopelessness of the past were still fresh in her mind. Sophie had never allowed herself to dream that her life could change so quickly and miraculously. However, even in the midst of this happiness, a deep fear began to creep into her heart. She feared that she might not be good enough to enter the professional world of music, where the finest students from all over the world gathered. Sophie also worried that her dream would become a burden for her father, who had silently endured countless hardships just to nurture her dreams. The thought caused her to clutch her small hands tightly, her heart filled with conflicting emotions. The car slowly came to a stop in front of a grand classical building, standing proudly among rows of lush green trees. In front of the large gate was an elegant golden inscription, "Whitmore Conservatory." Sophie stepped out of the car, her eyes wide with awe as she gazed at the place she had never dared to imagine, even in her wildest dreams. This was not just one of the top music schools in the United States, but a symbol of a completely new world, one of talent, pride, and intense pressure. Whitmore led Sophie and her father inside. The long corridor was lined with white marble, and the towering walls were adorned with images of famous artists who had graduated from here. Every corner exuded a sense of luxury and authority, making Sophie feel smaller and more out of place than ever. Her heart began to race, and the feeling of unease intensified. As Sophie was lost in her thoughts, Daniel Whitmore gently guided her and her father to the office of the conservatory's principal. Upon entering the large room, they were met by an elderly woman with white hair, exuding a dignified presence. This was Margaret Sullivan, the renowned principal of Whitmore Conservatory, known for her strictness and her adherence to principles. Ms. Sullivan looked at Sophie with sharp but curious eyes, before turning to Daniel Whitmore and asking in a calm but clear voice, "Daniel, I hear you wish to introduce a special student to me today?" Whitmore nodded gently and approached Miss Sullivan, speaking quietly but clearly enough for Sophie to hear every word. "Yes, Margaret. This is Sophie Carter, the girl I believe will be the most exceptional talent we've ever admitted." Principal Sullivan raised an eyebrow in surprise at Whitmore's bold statement. She looked at Sophie again, her previously cold gaze softening a little, revealing genuine interest and curiosity. She then asked Sophie in a firm yet caring tone, "Sophie, are you ready to step into such a demanding environment?" Sophie felt her breath catch in her throat. She glanced around the room and then turned to look at her father. Mr. James Carter smiled gently at her, his eyes full of complete trust in his daughter. Sophie found a bit of courage, responding to Miss Sullivan as sincerely as she could. "Ma'am, I know this is an incredible opportunity I never dared to dream of, but I am also very worried. I'm not sure if I am good enough to study here." Miss Sullivan was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the small girl standing before her. Finally, she smiled softly, a rare smile from the woman known for her strictness. "Sophie, someone who worries and doubts their own abilities is exactly the person who strives to become exceptional. You are an exception, and today I will make an exception. Sophie Carter, Whitmore Conservatory will offer you a full scholarship immediately, breaking all the usual admissions rules." The room fell into absolute silence at Principal Sullivan's unexpected decision. Sophie felt like she could no longer stand on her feet. A wave of emotions surged through her, joy, gratitude, mingled with confusion and fear. She looked at her father and Daniel Whitmore, and in their eyes she saw 1,000 unspoken words. The door to her future had been opened, but was Sophie truly ready to step through it? That question echoed in her heart, signaling that the journey ahead would be filled with challenges she had never known before. In the blink of an eye, Sophie's life had turned to an entirely new chapter. As the massive doors of the Whitmore Conservatory closed behind her, she suddenly felt as though she was stepping into a strange and mysterious world. The vast hallways, modern classrooms filled with gleaming instruments, and the well-dressed students laughing and chatting among themselves, all left Sophie in awe. That feeling of both fascination and confusion quickly crept into her heart. On her first day in class, Sophie carefully entered the main practice room of the conservatory. The large room was bathed in soft light streaming from tall windows, illuminating a shiny piano in the center. Around her, young students, most of whom came from wealthy aristocratic families, were chatting animatedly. As soon as Sophie entered, the chatter immediately stopped, and all eyes turned to her, filled with curiosity and judgment. A blonde girl with delicate features but cold eyes whispered to the person sitting next to her, her voice just loud enough for Sophie to hear. "Oh, look who's here. It's the black girl who's been specially favored by Whitmore. I wonder if her talent is real or just a PR stunt." The girl's name was Clara Beaumont, the daughter of a wealthy and well-known family in the art world. Clara stood out at the conservatory, not only for her exceptional talent, but also for her haughty, cold personality, and she had never hidden her disdain for students she deemed to be of lower social standing. To Clara, Sophie seemed like an undeserving, fortunate exception, and she couldn't hide her jealousy mixed with contempt. Sophie swallowed hard, trying to stay calm in the face of Clara's cruel words. She sat down on a chair near the door and gently took her old violin out of its case. The violin, scratched deeply with worn wood, immediately caught the attention of the other students. A few of them smirked, exchanging looks filled with mocking amusement. At that moment, the door to the room opened, and a tall man in his 60s walked in. With a stern, sharp gaze and neatly trimmed silver beard, he was none other than Professor Thomas Callahan, the most notoriously strict instructor at the conservatory, who had trained many of the world's finest musicians. His mere presence made the room instantly fall into complete silence. Professor Callahan scanned the room, then stopped in front of Sophie with a completely emotionless expression. He spoke in a low, cold voice full of authority. "Sophie Carter, stand up." Sophie jolted to her feet, her body freezing under the professor's sharp gaze. Callahan walked closer, took her old violin from her hands, examined it carefully, and then sighed. "This violin doesn't meet the standards here. I understand your circumstances, but you should know that here, at this conservatory, we don't have room for pity or exceptions. If you want to prove yourself, you need to do it with your own talent and technique, not by relying on special help from anyone." His words hit Sophie like a cold splash of water, making her tremble with the sting of his criticism. However, she didn't say anything, only lowered her head and quietly took the violin back from the professor. Clara's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as she watched Sophie struggle and feel humiliated. In the following days, Sophie endured the most intense and grueling practice sessions of her life under the harsh and relentless guidance of Professor Callahan. He constantly challenged her with extremely difficult technical exercises, far beyond Sophie's current abilities. Each time she made a mistake, no matter how small, he would sigh in disappointment and coldly remark in front of all the students, "Perhaps you were hyped up too early. I don't see anything special in you, just some fleeting emotions. Here, you have to prove yourself with your technique, not by relying on the audience's sympathy." Each time, Sophie felt a sharp pain in her chest. The professor's biting remarks, coupled with the subtle ridicule from Clara and a few other wealthy students, only deepened Sophie's self-doubt. Some nights she would cry quietly in her small dorm room, her hands trembling as she clutched her old violin, the loneliness consuming her thoughts. However, in her most desperate moments, Sophie would think of her father's face, Mr. James Carter, who had sacrificed everything for her to be here today. She remembered the pride in his eyes as he sent her off, the encouraging words from Daniel Whitmore, and she silently promised herself that she would not give up easily under this pressure. One late afternoon, when everyone else had left the practice room, Sophie stayed behind to practice alone. She repeated the complex techniques over and over until her fingers ached, her small hands beginning to bleed from the small cuts. Yet Sophie didn't stop. Each drop of sweat fell, mixing with her tears, but she was determined to push beyond her limits. From the far corner of the practice room, Professor Callahan stood silently, observing the girl with a deep, thoughtful gaze. His stern face softened slightly, his cold eyes slowly shifting into a more focused attention. Inside, a flicker of surprise and admiration began to grow as he witnessed the incredible resilience of this small student. Still, Sophie didn't know that the real challenge awaiting her at Whitmore Conservatory was only just beginning. The days ahead would be filled with relentless struggles, where Sophie would not only have to fight against prejudice and envy, but also overcome her own limitations to prove she truly deserved the rare opportunity fate had given her. The first days at the Whitmore Conservatory passed by like the toughest challenge Sophie had ever faced in her life. While back at her old school, the mocking glances and cruel words had caused her heart pain. Here, the invisible pressure of fierce competition and overwhelming expectations was 100 times more frightening. After her first difficult practice session with Professor Callahan, Sophie quickly realized that she was not just facing technical challenges. Day by day, she began to feel the coldness and subtle discrimination from the wealthier students, like Clara Beaumont. Clara was always the center of attention in every class, surrounded by friends who looked down on Sophie as if she didn't belong in their elite circle. One day, during a break between practice sessions, Sophie overheard Clara whispering to her friends in the hallway, "I'm sure Mr. Whitmore is just pitying her. A girl who's never had formal training, with that old violin, thinking she can compare with us." The soft, mocking laughter that followed felt like sharp needles stabbing into Sophie's heart. Despite trying to remain strong, Clara's cruel words made Sophie question herself. However, Sophie was determined not to let those things break her. She practiced twice, 3 times as hard as her classmates, staying in the practice room late at night after everyone else had gone back to the dorms. Her fingers began to swell, becoming calloused and sometimes bleeding from the intense practice. Some mornings, she could barely hold her violin because of the sharp pain in her fingertips. But Sophie reminded herself that this pain was nothing compared to the sacrifices her father, Mr. James Carter, had endured for so many years. One late night, Sophie, exhausted and despairing, sat curled up in a corner of the practice room. Silent tears of helplessness rolled down her small face. In that moment, she wanted to give up, to leave this lavish but oppressive place and return to her father, where she knew there would at least be some peace and safety. But in her darkest moment, Sophie remembered her father's words when they said goodbye. "I will never regret the sacrifices I've made for you, Sophie. No matter how hard it gets, always remember that I'm here. Always proud of you." Those heartfelt words echoed in Sophie's mind, becoming the strength she needed to rise from her despair and continue her grueling journey. Sophie stood up, wiped away her tears, and took her violin again with a determination stronger than ever before. As time passed, Sophie's extraordinary perseverance began to yield tangible results. Her technique improved noticeably day by day. Her fingers became more nimble, and her handling of each note became more skillful and natural. Not only that, but the emotion in her playing also grew deeper and more mature, as if every pain, every tear, and every pressure she had endured had merged into her music, creating something full of life and deeply moving. Gradually, even the students who had once looked down on Sophie began to take notice of her. In group practice sessions, Sophie was frequently called to perform the most difficult pieces, and each time, she made the entire class fall silent, listening with amazement and admiration. Clara Beaumont, who had once been the fiercest opponent of Sophie's presence, now began to feel uneasy. Clara had always prided herself on being the best student, but lately, Sophie's progress had been putting pressure on her. One day, when Professor Callahan asked them both to perform the same piece of music, Clara was confident she would easily outshine Sophie. However, as soon as Sophie began to play the first notes on her violin, Clara knew that things were no longer as easy as before. The music Sophie played that day was powerful yet delicate. Each note seemed to dance in the air, telling a story of challenges, pain, and resilience. When Sophie finished, the entire class erupted into applause, with some even standing to show their exceptional admiration. Professor Callahan, known for his strictness and rarely showing emotion, nodded in approval, a rare expression of satisfaction on his face. "There's no denying it anymore, Sophie. You've made great progress. I had doubts about your abilities, but today, you've shown me that persistence and effort can create miracles. Keep it up." Those rare words of praise from the notoriously tough professor made Sophie feel like her heart was about to burst with emotion. Finally, after months of relentless practice, she had earned the recognition of the person who had once doubted her the most. However, Sophie knew this was just the beginning. To truly prove her worth at Whitmore Conservatory, she would have to face even more difficult challenges. But Sophie was no longer afraid, because she knew that no matter how hard it got, she always had an invisible strength from the love and faith of her father. And just as Sophie had predicted, the journey ahead would continue to present her with even greater challenges that would ultimately determine her future at this prestigious conservatory. The rare words of praise from Professor Callahan had become a source of strength for Sophie in her journey to prove herself at the Whitmore Conservatory. From the girl who was once looked down upon and ridiculed, Sophie had now gradually won over even the harshest of critics with her talent and extraordinary effort. But she knew well that all the challenges she had faced so far were just preparation for the most important day, the conservatory's annual concert, an event every student here eagerly awaited to be a part of. On a quiet afternoon, as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the large windows of the practice room, Sophie was focused on her practice when the door suddenly opened. Professor Callahan stepped in, his usual stern demeanor mixed with something different today. He watched her for a long moment before speaking in his deep voice. "Sophie, this year's major concert at the conservatory will feature many renowned artists and important figures in the music industry. After careful consideration, I've decided to have you perform a solo piece. This is a big opportunity, but also a significant pressure. Do you think you're ready?" Sophie was stunned, her small hands holding the bow trembling with emotion and nervousness. Her heart beat faster as she realized this wasn't just an opportunity to prove her abilities, but it could also directly influence the music career she had always dreamed of. "Professor, I'm not sure if I'm good enough," Sophie stammered, her gaze momentarily filled with doubt. Professor Callahan looked straight into her eyes with a determined gaze, and responded with rare sincerity. "You're not the first student I've ever trained, Sophie, but there is one thing I'm certain of. You are the one who expresses music with the truest heart I have ever encountered. Prepare well, because this is your chance to prove to everyone, and more importantly, to yourself, that you are worthy." His words gave Sophie renewed strength, and she nodded quietly, her resolve solidified once again. In the days that followed, Sophie practiced like never before. She woke up early every morning, and at night, when all her classmates had gone back to their dorms, she stayed late, practicing until her fingers almost lost all feeling. Sophie knew this performance would be the defining moment of her life. Time flew by, and finally the most important night of the year arrived, the concert. The grand hall of Whitmore Conservatory was lavishly decorated, with a multitude of renowned artists, music critics, and prestigious sponsors confirming their attendance. The atmosphere in the conservatory was more tense than ever. The other students couldn't stop talking, their curious and admiring eyes constantly on Sophie, the poor black girl who had once been disregarded, now the center of attention at the entire conservatory. However, on the evening before the performance, as Sophie was walking down the hallway to practice one last time, she unexpectedly saw a familiar man standing in front of a large notice board in the lobby. Sophie froze. Her heart seemingly stopped in her chest as she recognized him. It was Mr. Reynolds, her former teacher from Ashwood, the one who had caused her so much pain with his prejudice and cruel words in the past. In an instant, all the painful memories of her past came rushing back like a flood. The mocking words, the disdainful looks, the feeling of rejection and isolation gripped Sophie's small heart once again. Mr. Reynolds turned around and their eyes met. Sophie immediately saw the surprise and confusion in his eyes. She quickly turned away, hastily walking down the hallway, her breath erratic and confused. She rushed into the practice room, slammed the door shut, and leaned against it, her legs almost giving way under the weight of her fear. Suddenly, Sophie felt as if all her efforts up until this point were about to crumble. She couldn't shake the cruel words Mr. Reynolds had said in the past, the very words that made her think she wasn't worthy of music, not good enough, not talented enough to go far. Sophie wondered if tomorrow, on that grand stage, she would be able to overcome this fear. In that moment of despair, Sophie thought of her father, Mr. James Carter. She remembered his gentle, self-sacrificing face, his calloused hands, and the proud, loving look he had given her on the day she first entered Whitmore Conservatory. Sophie took a deep breath, trying to reassure herself. She reminded herself that the cruel words of Mr. Reynolds couldn't destroy the dream she had worked so hard to build with her own strength. Just then, the practice room door creaked open, and Professor Callahan entered. He looked at Sophie for a moment, then gently spoke. "I see you're hesitating. Are you worried about tomorrow?" Sophie remained silent, nodding slightly. Professor Callahan approached, looking her directly in the eyes. For the first time, his voice softened with gentleness. "Tomorrow, Sophie, you're not standing on that stage just to perform for those who have doubted you. You will stand there to prove to yourself that you are strong enough to overcome any challenge. I believe in you." The unexpected words of encouragement from the strict professor lightened Sophie's heart. She took a deep breath, determined that she would not let anyone, especially those who had hurt her, make her falter again. Tomorrow would be the defining moment of Sophie's future, and she knew she could not afford to fail. The bright stage lights illuminated Sophie's small face, blurring everything around her, leaving only the overwhelming feeling of emptiness and nervousness so intense it felt suffocating. The scattered applause from the vast auditorium quickly faded, replaced by an absolute silence, one that made Sophie feel as if she were standing before the entire world, exposed and fragile. She gripped her old violin tightly, her palms wet with sweat, her heart pounding as if it might leap out of her chest. In that moment, a flood of familiar images appeared in Sophie's mind. She saw the face of her father, Mr. James Carter, his gentle expression and calloused hands always carefully fixing her violin whenever it broke. Sophie remembered the trusting and proud look in his eyes the day he sent her off to Whitmore Conservatory. His gaze had helped her overcome countless moments of despair. She also remembered the days of being discriminated against, the cruel, mocking laughter, and the cold, disdainful eyes of Mr. Reynolds, who had once made her doubt her very ability. Thinking of Mr. Reynolds, Sophie's heart tightened, a wave of confusion nearly causing her to falter. But immediately she reminded herself that she had endured so much pain, and she wouldn't let anyone or any memory make her fall now. Sophie took a deep breath and lifted her violin to her shoulder. The moment she placed the bow to the strings, a strange strength seemed to awaken within her small body. Sophie closed her eyes, letting her heart merge completely with the music. The first notes of the violin played softly, gently, like a whisper, telling the story of a forgotten child, once overlooked and ridiculed, but never losing hope. Sophie's music gradually grew stronger, deeper, and more moving, carrying all the pain, the silent tears, and the unwavering resilience to never succumb to harsh prejudices. The auditorium was completely immersed in passionate silence. All those present couldn't take their eyes off the small girl standing in the middle of the vast stage, the bright lights surrounding her slender figure, creating an image both beautiful and deeply emotional. Those who had once doubted Sophie, who had once silently mocked her, like Clara Beaumont, could no longer hide the astonishment and admiration in their eyes. At the back of the auditorium, Mr. Reynolds sat motionless, his eyes fixed on Sophie. A strange feeling rose within him, admiration mixed with profound regret, something he never thought he would experience. He remembered the cruel words, the disdainful looks he had given Sophie, and suddenly realized that he had made a terrible mistake. He had once overlooked an extraordinary talent simply because of narrow-minded prejudices. Now, as he watched Sophie perform with all her heart, Mr. Reynolds felt his chest tighten with shame. On the stage, Sophie was completely unaware of the emotions stirring in the hearts of those who had once hurt her. She was entirely lost in the music, each note no longer just a performance, but a true liberation. Sophie seemed to soar on the music, as if all the pressures, all the pain she had once endured, had now transformed into the most beautiful melodies she could create. The music built to its crescendo, and the auditorium seemed to hold its breath, hundreds of hearts beating in sync with each note Sophie played. When the music ended with a long, resonant note, Sophie slowly opened her eyes. In that moment, she realized that the entire audience had risen to their feet, their applause echoing throughout the hall like a storm of sound, filled with emotion and admiration. Sophie stood still on stage, her heart vibrating with intensity, tears unexpectedly falling as she saw her father, Mr. James Carter, the small, humble man at the back of the auditorium, quietly wiping the tears of pride from his weathered face. Sophie felt that she had truly triumphed, not just over the doubts of others, but most importantly over the fears and insecurities deep within her own soul. Amid the applause that seemed to go on forever, Mr. Reynolds rose from his seat and slowly walked toward the stage. He stood there, staring at Sophie for a long time, his eyes filled with sincerity and profound regret. Finally, Mr. Reynolds gave a slight nod, a silent apology and deep acknowledgement that he wanted to convey to Sophie. Sophie looked directly at Mr. Reynolds, her heart no longer filled with hatred, but with forgiveness and an overwhelming sense of peace. She knew that she had passed the most important test of her life, and from this moment on she would no longer allow anyone or anything to stop her from pursuing her dreams. For Sophie, that moment was when she officially stepped out of the shadows of the past and into the future, with all the inner strength and fierce belief in herself, things no one could ever take away from her again. The thunderous applause from the entire auditorium didn't fade. Instead, it grew stronger and more intense, pulling Sophie from her daze back into reality. The stage lights still shone brightly on her tear-streaked face, but this time, the tears weren't signs of hurt or fear. They were a manifestation of complete happiness, a release from the shadows of the past and the heavy weight of prejudice. At the far corner of the stage, Mr. James Carter stood frozen. His rugged face now shone brightly in the stage light, his gentle eyes filled with pride and emotion. The poor man who had once bowed his head to life's injustices was now able to lift it and watch his daughter shine. His calloused hands trembled slightly as he wiped away the tears streaming down his cheeks, his heart overflowing with an unprecedented sense of joy. From the audience, Mr. Reynolds stood still, his eyes fixed on Sophie with genuine admiration mixed with deep regret. He knew that from this moment forward, he would never be able to view anyone through the lens of prejudice again. His life had been forever changed by the small girl he once looked down on, a girl who had taught him the most profound lesson about the value of every human being. While the applause continued unabated, a familiar figure slowly walked up onto the stage. Daniel Whitmore, dressed in a luxurious and elegant suit, approached Sophie with a warm smile. He gently placed his hand on her shoulder, then looked down at the audience with pride and emotion in his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen, today, we are not only witnessing an outstanding performance, but also an extraordinary journey. Sophie Carter is not just a talented student, she is the living proof of what music can do, transcending all limits, breaking all barriers, and overcoming all prejudices." The auditorium fell silent for a moment, hanging on every word Whitmore spoke, before applause erupted once again, louder and more heartfelt than before. Whitmore raised his hand, signaling for silence, and continued with an inspiring tone. "Today, I am proud to announce that Sophie Carter has been officially selected as a special prospective candidate for some of the most prestigious international performance programs. The world's top artists and music judges agree that this young girl's talent will not only stop at an incredible performance, but will spread, inspiring audiences across the globe." This announcement immediately sent the entire room into a frenzy of applause and enthusiastic cheers. Everyone present understood that This wasn't just Sophie's personal success, but a turning point in the fight against social injustice and prejudice. Sophie stood on the stage, stunned by the words she had just heard. She turned to Daniel Whitmore, her eyes shining with emotion, her voice trembling as she softly spoke. I truly don't know what to say, other than a deep sense of gratitude to everyone who has believed in me, especially my father, who has always silently sacrificed so I could stand here today." Whitmore nodded gently, smiling back at Sophie. "Sophie, it is you who has taught all of us an invaluable lesson about courage, perseverance, and belief. Be proud of yourself, because what you did today will continue to inspire forever." At that moment, Mr. James Carter slowly made his way to the stage. Sophie saw him, unable to hold back her tears any longer. She ran into his arms, crying in overwhelming happiness. Mr. James embraced his daughter tightly, a warmth and pride filling his heart. "I always knew you could do it, Sophie. You are the greatest thing that ever happened in my life. I am so incredibly proud of you." Father and daughter stood there, embracing in the bright lights of the stage, and that image was etched into the hearts of all those who witnessed it, becoming a powerful symbol of love, courage, and the strength to overcome social prejudice. In the audience, Clara Beaumont silently watched Sophie with genuine admiration and regret. The girl who had once been arrogant now understood that she, too, had learned a valuable lesson about respect and humility. Clara realized that she had been wrong to judge Sophie based on her background and skin color. In that moment, Sophie understood that she had not just overcome her own fate, but had helped many others realize that a person's worth should never be determined by their skin color or social status. The powerful human message Sophie conveyed today would continue to spread, helping to break down barriers and prejudices, creating a better world for everyone. And for Sophie, this was just the beginning of a long and meaningful journey ahead, one where she would continue to use her music to sow seeds of hope, kindness, and unity across the world. Amid the dazzling stage lights, Sophie smiled gently, knowing she was truly ready for the new journey, with a heart full of passion and a strong belief in herself, in the power to change the world with the best qualities within every person. Sophie Carter's story is not just a journey about talent and the determination to overcome the fate of a poor black girl, but also a powerful message about courage and the ability to overcome all prejudices and discrimination in society. Through Sophie's journey, we understand that no matter where you come from, no matter what your skin color is, with dreams and determination, you can conquer the heights you aim for. What about you? Have you ever experienced or witnessed any form of prejudice in life? Share your story below, and let's create a difference together.